Hello, hello, hello. This is Adrienne Berg, and this is The Ageless Traveler. And this is second in our series because I am an inveterate Anglophile. I always say I don't believe in past lives, but if I did, I probably was an Englishwoman. I don't know why I love it so much, but I do. Now, one of the things I love about it are the historic homes. There's no doubt about it that for me, 1980 is my best year. Why? Because the pound was equal to the dollar, and I took a big container of antiques from England home. I still have them today. So, what would it really be like, though? What would it be like to live in one of those grand homes? Maybe something like England's Beaver Castle, which you may have seen as the substitute for Windsor Castle in The Crown. What would it really be like? Well, we're going to tell you because we have an incredible guest today by Countess Violet Garnock. She's founder, curator, and leader of HeritageXplore. HeritageXplore is a wonderful new concept where you can actually become an insider in these beautiful homes that you've been longing to see and maybe you only saw on the screen. So, Countess, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for having me. I'm so happy to be with you and all of your listeners.
Well, we're going to talk about HeritageXplore, but I have to tell you that I'm tickled just to say the word Viscountess. Sounds great. And we'll talk about what that's like. But first, let's take a deep dive into what you've created here for all of us, which is HeritageXplore. Explain what we can experience through your curation.
So HeritageXplore was launched approximately sort of 2 years ago. It'll be 2 years in May. So we're still, relatively new. But as you mentioned in your introduction, I grew up in a historic house called Beaver Castle, spelt Belvoir. So our listeners don't get confused with the other spelling of Beaver. Beaver means beautiful view. It sits on the top of this incredible hill in the heart of England. And I grew up there for my whole life, and so I have an acute understanding of what it really means to spend time in and enjoy the surroundings and obviously the interiors and the architecture and the stories of somewhere like Beaver. And so inspired by my childhood there, and then also inspired by a podcast like yours that I created in 2020, I created HeritageXplore. And really, HeritageXplore has two parts. We have our membership, which is you can become a member of HeritageXplore, like you can become a member of the National Trust. You mentioned that you're a member of the National Trust before you went on air. And by virtue of becoming a member, you really get access to the most intimate stories about what's happening in and at our historic houses in the United Kingdom. And then HeritageXplore Luxe is our other side of the business, and that is where we take people on a physical journey into and staying at these incredible independent historic houses. So I hope there's something that we've built for everyone. For people that don't or aren't able to travel this year, the HeritageXplore Club really gives you this kind of online access to the most amazing and enriching stories about what's happening at our member houses. And then Lux is really for people that want to get on a plane and come and see these places for themselves and stay in them. We actually make it possible to stay in these historic homes, which I think I'm right in saying no other company does in the United Kingdom, not with these houses. So it's a really unique thing that we've managed to build, which is wonderful and exciting.
So let's take a look at the travel side of the two parts that you've created here. The people who own the homes, who own these homes, in general, are they the original owners? Does the person who is traveling with you get to meet them, see what their life is like with regard to that? Yeah, tell us
Yes.
about that. Tell us about the travel experience here.
Yeah, so the travel experience is exactly that. The idea is that you arrive in London. We have a wonderful partnership in place with Claridge's Hotel, of course. That is
Of
where
course.
my that is where my grandmother and great grandmother both, were besotted by Claridge's kind of famous domed room that you walk into for afternoon tea. So we start at Claridge's and everyone, lands into London. And then we go off on this 4-day adventure, 3 evenings. Every single time we arrive at a historic house, you are greeted by and hosted by the owners of that house. They are our hosts. And I am on the journey as well with everyone. But it gives us such a wonderful opportunity to, to really give people that insider access to what it really means. And most importantly, in my view, to hear the familial history that's passed down from generation to generation. Nothing beats hearing about a historic house from the owner themselves. And that's really what we've managed to create very uniquely with these tours. We only host these tours 3 times a year, and the reason being is that they are still family homes. So they're very unique and special halo moments in a year where we can really, bring people into the sort of inner sanctum of, what it means to live in and experience historic houses from the inside, basically.
It fascinates me beyond measure because, first of all, I'm fascinated by the houses. I've said many times, I'm not quite sure why. I think because in my own home, which was, and I mentioned to you, in Brooklyn, my mother was fascinated by these. And we would
Mm,
often have beautiful pieces, just a piece or two, because
hmm.
for her, it was an indication of culture and being
Yes.
culture. On the other hand, as press, I've met a lot of people who've owned these homes, and I
Mhm,
put them in two categories, and this is my question to you.
mhm,
There are those that open their homes because they have to. They don't want to let go of these beautiful homes, and they need to make them a moneymaker. They're
mhm,
often very absent when
mhm,
something does happen, like an excursion to their home. You won't see them.
mhm.
The others seem to be entirely on the other side. They can't wait for you to open their door. They can't wait to tell you every story. Sometimes you just, it's time to go. But
Yeah.
and on and on. Before you know it, it's their great grandfather, the next grandfather, to tell you about their dog. It doesn't seem to be in between. So are
Yeah.
you selecting these houses based not just on the house, but the personality of the owners?
Great question. So, because of the other side of the business that I mentioned, the kind of membership side, we launched the membership side before we launched Lux, and so I've really got to know the houses, the teams very intimately over the last 2 years, and so it's meant that I do recognize exactly what you're describing in both cases. And I have been, of course, selective about, the houses that we choose, the hosts that, come with them. And also, of course, the comfort of the houses. Not all of these historic houses have got adjoining bathrooms. That was not a priority. But so, neither of those things were a priority in the kind of 18th century, 17th century, whenever these castles or houses were built. But lots of houses have gone to great lengths to make them much more comfortable, very warm, physically. And so, all of that sort of factors into where I decide we're going to go with my team on every Lux tour. And as I said, because we only do 3 a year, it means that we really do give it a huge amount of thought and really just pick the best of the best as we see it. And obviously, the route is really important. It's got to make geographical sense as well. So everything factors in, really. But I do know exactly what you're describing, that's for sure.
So, two practical questions. In general, how many homes might you be in a 3 day period? And the
So,
other is the arts. Is there an opportunity to learn about the art that's in these homes? So, how many might we see, and what is the cultural aspect of what you're showing us?
yeah, so in regards to how many you see on a tour, it ranges from about 4 to 6 houses that you'll see in the course of those 3 nights and 4 days. So the days are busy, but they are well timed. And, I think this is the other interesting thing about the UK as well, is that more often than not, there are pockets of of England especially, that have got huge clusters of historic houses all within quite close proximity to one another. So it means that actually, while 6 houses in 4 days sounds like a huge amount. It's actually very doable in terms of distance. We're not as big as America as a country, you must remember. And so actually, the logistics of driving from one to the other with all of our guests have their own chauffeur-driven car whilst they're on the tour. And the drivers all drive in kind of convoy to every location. And so there's no coaches in sight with what we do. And it means that yeah, we can make good time and it sort of it works really well. There's a lovely pace to the days. You don't feel rushed, but you also don't feel, bored either. So, the art is every house is so different. So, as an example, if I think about the tour that's coming up in May, one of our houses is called Elvedon. And that has been owned by the Guinness family, the family that founded Guinness beer. for the last 103 years. But it previous to that was owned by the Maharaja he was called Maharaja Duleep Singh, and he was the Maharaja of Punjab in India, and he was Queen Victoria's friend and then sadly foe. And so that house, as it currently stands, is totally empty. So there's no art to see in there. You are simply staring at the most extraordinary, innate, ostentatious, opulent. I just can't think of enough words to describe it, but the architecture is really why we're going to that house.
Mhm.
But then you go to Euston, which is where actually in May our guests will stay for 2 nights, with the Duke and Duchess of Grafton. And there is the most exceptional art collection there you can imagine. And so, dating from really the 15th century right the way through to contemporary art now. And that will be exceptional. And the tour will definitely be anchored in the art. So I would say, there is kind of something for everyone on these luxe tours. I think if you're really interested in architecture, then Elvedon will light you up. And then I think you'll equally have the opportunity to learn a lot about art in our time at Euston. So I've tried to curate it so it really feels like there's something for everyone that does decide to join us, basically.
Well, that's a beautiful thing to do, and it's a wonderful thing that you've created. We're going to take a little break. We come back, we're going to talk about a couple of things. One is, what should we wear? Because we want to know what the experience feels like with regard to the atmosphere. We're going to talk about more about HeritageXplore itself and how you're supporting some of these wonderful places so that they are acknowledged. And we're going to talk about what we could learn first before we go, so that we're really well prepared to get the most to maximize our experience with you. So you guys, don't you go anywhere. We'll be right back. To become and stay an ageless traveler, subscribe to our free weekly newsletter, Travel Tuesday. Just visit agelesstraveler.com, click subscribe, and enter your name and email for a surprise gift. What's the surprise? Well, if I tell you, it's not a surprise. What I can say is that Travel Tuesday tackles travel barriers like money, health, companionship, and even travel burnout, and gives you a taste of what our blog and podcast have to offer every single week, helping you explore the world effortlessly. And now we're back, and we're back with the Viscountess. I just like to say that. I'll say it again. Viscountess Violet Garnock. Now, she grew up in a castle. The castle is called Beaver Castle because of its beautiful view. It was a stand-in for the Windsor Castle in The Crown. So you might have seen that. We're going to talk about what it felt like to her personally in a few minutes. But first, we're going to really take a deeper dive into what she's doing. She's created is HeritageXplore. There's a mission statement here, and that is to make sure that these homes are available for you to see and that they don't disintegrate, they don't get mowed down to make a parking lot. Tell us what your efforts are with regard to preservation.
Yeah, so in the United Kingdom, there are 1,450 independent historic houses. So some of your listeners, and I know you are familiar with the National Trust.
Yes.
The National Trust is in fact a public organization. So that's a charitable organization that owns approximately 250 houses. So the houses that we work with sit outside of the National Trust properties and they are independently owned. So they receive no funding from the government. They receive no funding from any of our national funding kind of organizations in this country. They really are and have been left to fend for themselves really since sort of post-World War II. During the war, the majority of historic houses across the UK became, safe havens, be it for documents from the House of Lords and House of Commons, or, were turned into schools or were turned into hospitals. And really, it's probably fair to say that since World War II, there's been an increasing debt of preservation and restoration that has not been taking place at these independent houses, and not through lack of want, but through lack of funding. And to give you a figure, actually, Adrian, it's actually 2 billion that's essentially waiting to be done in restoration work at those 1,400 houses, which is a sizable amount of money that needs to be spent to keep these houses standing in the way that we see them today. So, and I think a big part of what I see our role at Heritage Explore as is fundamentally education, because I think so often people can be mistaken for thinking, and obviously we all love Downton Abbey, Bridgerton, we
Yeah.
all love all those period movies. But it's not the reality of life today, as we all know it. And it's very much the same at these historic houses. There are lots of people that work at them. There is definitely still an incumbent family that's in charge of them. But there is a huge amount of work, and the costs of obviously, like all of us in the world, like costs have gone up of restoring anything, and historic houses are no exception. Our membership side of Heritage Explore is so exciting because it gives people an opportunity to really feel like they are making a tangible difference. When you sign up to Heritage Explore and become a member, you automatically are effectively supporting independent houses that we work with and represent. We offer to all of our members the most amazing access, whether it's to fascinating calls with the head restoration specialist at Blenheim Palace, where they're currently spending 10 million on the roof. We have these sort of online seminars that really give people an idea, and that they're interested in learning a bit more about what does it take to restore a palace roof? The fascinating things that I've always wanted to learn about. We actually allow and enable that to happen when you are a club member. So I think a big part of what I see as our work is fundamentally, getting the word out there about these independent houses, not just the frothy, sort of fun kind of stories,
Right.
which of
Right.
course we all love, but actually, really get under the bonnet, get under that sort of 3 acre roof of Blenheim and understand what it really means and takes to restore a roof of that size in 2026. It's fascinating.
Well, I'll tell you that I think there's another aspect to it as well, because I took a good look at what you're offering, and that is an affinity group. Not
Yeah.
everybody is doing their own restoration, but I've had the privilege and headache of owning two historic homes.
Oh,
One,
wow.
believe it or not, was in the great state of New Jersey. It was built in 1872 and
Mhm.
and had Tiffany windows, and the entire neighborhood today is called Montrose Park. It's
Yeah.
on the National Register. My home was a significant home, and you can do a whole YouTube on my roof because it was a tile roof. So I know exactly see how much Blenheim and I have in
In
common.
common. Yeah, exactly.
But there's another
Exactly.
aspect. I live in a historic home now, and it's entirely different because it's a built community in the 60s, a modernism community by one of our star architects. For me to get personal benefits, financial benefits like tax rebates and this type of thing, I have to restore my place. And in doing that, it requires me to take enclosed areas and open them because there are balconies here, but they were enclosed when I bought it, and that's very expensive. So anybody who's actually going through or desires to have a historic home has to understand that these
Good
things
point.
happen, and maybe your group is an affinity group to even share these pains and these interests and this information and just see that you're not alone. Even people who own castles are in the same position that you are.
I think that's such a good point. I think it's a community ultimately. It's an affinity group, a community of people that have a fundamental interest and understanding of historic houses, and perhaps, as you've rightly said, maybe they're thinking, oh, I want to buy a historic house, but all of these things need to be thought about
Understood.
and taken into context. Yeah, for sure.
So we want to both preserve the romance, but also
Exactly.
you get to really see the reality behind it. Now, let's go back to the travel side because it's just such a wonderful thing to plan. And that is the ambiance, the feeling. Now, again, pure travel questions. What do we pack? What happens in the evening? What's the food like? Give us a clue.
Oh my gosh, this is probably three of my favorite areas. I mean, I love talking about the house, and the tours themselves, but there is nothing quite like, being in your beautiful sort of state bedroom at an amazing historic house. And then, getting into having your black tie dress hanging on the wardrobe, the lovely walnut, wardrobe, and then kind of getting ready and putting on your black tie and or long evening gown, and then heading down to the state dining rooms, whichever that might be, for a beautiful dinner. Obviously, there's always drinks before dinner, champagne, cocktails. One of our houses that I've just recently come back from visiting, that's featuring in May's tour that's coming up at the end of May. The Duke and Duchess of Grafton, they've just recently redecorated Euston very sensitively, very in keeping with its history and heritage, but it was long overdue, some investment. And it took them a year to empty the whole house. So it took them a whole 365 days to get every single item out of that house, which is extraordinary. But they have the most amazing bar that they've put in under these huge stairs that kind of wind down. And at the bottom of the bar, at the bottom of the stairs, spiral stairs, is this beautiful bar that's tucked underneath the stairs. And I think there's just something so exciting about the evenings of these luxe tours because, as I said, every night the dress code is either black tie or cocktail, and we always stipulate that on our brochures. And so, yeah, everyone comes down for dinner. We have a lovely drinks reception, tends to be in the drawing room or, the kind of equivalent, the library, depending on which house we're in. And then we head into the dining room or the state dining room for dinner. And actually, a really important part for me and for estate owners as well, is that when we are hosting these tours, the food is local. So we might have an incredible Michelin star chef, but
Mhm.
he is using local meat from the estate, or, lots of these estates have got their own cattle, their own sheep,
Your own
their own,
garden.
yeah, their own gardens, their own kitchen gardens. And it's really important to me that we have that produce that's on people's plates in the evening, because I think it brings to light for everyone, the incredible community that wraps around these estates and the amazing work that goes on, not just inside these houses, but outside of them. And, they are such examples in my mind of how, if we could, and if we all had that much space, we should all live, which is, with the land, eating, delicious, fresh food, be it from the sea or from the land. And so the menus really reflect that. So we tend to always choose food that's grown or from the estates that we're staying on. And obviously, if you're vegetarian or vegan, there's always a delicious option as an alternative. And then, like every good dinner party, Adrian, we then invite everyone to stay up. And if there's a snooker table, in the library or
Right.
the snooker room, everyone tends to, after dinner, go and enjoy playing snooker or sit by the fire with a glass of whiskey. And the night just rolls on and there's no curfew. To me, it's that part after dinner that it feels very familiar to me. Obviously, I was lucky enough to grow up in one of these houses, so that's long been a part of my experience of these historic houses. The kind of gecko mirrors, or the everything glitters in a very different way, and you see historic houses in a very different way after dark. And I think it's that I so cherish people seeing for themselves when hosting these Lux tours.
Well, that's a very, very beautiful thought, and it makes a terrific image. Uh,
Mm.
just by coincidence, one of the things that's very popular now, I'm going to one Saturday night, is candlelight music. Uh,
Yes,
this has
interesting.
become so popular here in the US where there's no other light but the candlelights, and you've got these beautiful guitarists or, you know, full orchestras sometimes, or
Yeah.
single chanteuse. So that's very, very beautiful. And
Mm.
as I said before, I wanted you to tell us how we should prepare. You explained about the dress codes and that they made very clear. Most people who'll be doing this already are aficionados of historic homes. I mean, the very few will not have been to one or two before, so we kind of get that gist. But
Mm.
again, something I've wanted to do, and I'll actually put this in our newsletter, is go to Oxford for a summer school, adult
Mm.
summer school, just on this, understanding historic houses and their place. So, is there something to read? Because I think if we simply go and watch The Crown, we will find your home in it. We're getting some Hollywood idea, of what we should know. But what do you think we should know?
I think what we've done really well on Heritage Explorer is every time you click onto like one of our houses through our platform. There's a bit of information about the family that still is incumbent there. Then there's a bit of information about the movies that have been made there. And I really try to give, I really always wanted to give that sort of 360-degree snapshot, what that house historically has been about, and also what it's doing today. Where could you have seen it today? And I think that's really important because these houses are, by virtue of the fact that families are still living in them, unlike, let's say, the National Trust properties, they are still living and breathing. They are still, history every day is being written in those houses still. So I think it's really important to me that we always, put the family somewhere at the forefront alongside the house and its history. But I think the key is, before you go to any of these houses, to spend some time, read about, the architect that built it. An interesting kind of observation, Adrian, is that the reason why beaver was used as, or in the crown, is because we had the same architect as Windsor Castle. And very cleverly, the location scout for Netflix spotted that. And so that's why beaver was used as a replica for Windsor Castle in the Crown, because James Wyatt, which was the commissioned architect who built Beaver's kind of famous round tower, is in fact the same architect that built Windsor Castle's famous round tower. And so, the location scout sort of spotted that. The architects of their day very often were hired by multiple historic houses. And so you can see the architect of their day, in their style kind of growing and developing and changing, and by virtue of the houses that they produced in their lifetime. I've also created a podcast called Hidden Heritage that hopefully helps people, educates people on what happens in independent historic houses, and that comes out every week, so people can listen to that. But I think the course at Oxford sounds amazing, and I think if I had the time, I'd do it as well.
Sounds wonderful. And so it's terrific to hear that there's a podcast. And then we come back, and I should have done this first, but I was saving the best for last, I think. I'm going to be talking to you about your experience. You mentioned the beauty of the evening, something I wouldn't have thought would have been first thought in your mind. But as a child growing up, that was something very impressive to you.
Mm.
I have some questions, but I deliberately did not tell you what they were before the show. So you should be prepared for anything. And everybody else as well. We will be right back. Don't go anywhere. Did you know that 3,000 people receive the Ageless Traveler newsletter every single Tuesday, and it's free of charge? Well, you simply subscribe on our website, agelesstraveler.com, when you see the pop-up, or take a look at the resource section that's in the show notes accompanying this episode. You'll also see how directly you can subscribe to our newsletter. Now, what will you find in there? Well, every single week, you will get news you can use about travel, cultural experiences you can enjoy, suggestions for luxury travel for less, and yes, I answer your questions. And you can even send me those questions by text or voicemail, and you'll see just how to do it when you receive your Travel Tuesday newsletter. Plenty of discounts, plenty of inspiration, so that you never stop traveling. That's agelesstraveler.com. Take a look at the pop-up, subscribe, or take a look at our resource list accompanying this and every episode, so that you get a direct link to Travel Tuesday. And now we're back, and we're kind of at the intimate part of what we're talking about. We have Countess Violet Garnock with us today. By the way, she went to UCLA, but she also went to beautiful school in England, in Yorkshire. So I have some personal questions for you. One of the things that's always impressed me, and I don't know if it's true, is that people that own these castles, these historic homes, have a responsibility to the community outside of them. You always see a fete being created by the lord of the manor. With great largesse, he invites the community, whether they're farmers or merchants. Is that true?
In a word, absolutely. And I'm not, and I think, again, people might think, oh, come off. People might think, oh, that's, over romanticizing. It isn't. I think actually really interestingly on my podcast this week, I've had someone who's the author of a book called Airs and Graces. And she actually refers to historic houses in her own words on the podcast this week and in our conversation. She said, historic houses were the welfare state of their day. But what's so interesting is that in her own words, and she's a tough journalist, like, Cookie, she's not someone to mince her words. And she references a particular family called the Naylor Leylands, or the Fitzwilliam family, who used to own Wandsworth Palace up in Yorkshire as well, the biggest palace, bigger than Buckingham Palace in the UK. And they would effectively ensure that everyone in the area received medication, received jabs, received, when the first sort of forms of medication started trickling through, they were committed to their community local to the palace, receiving that, and they paid the privilege for everyone to have that. In the same way, my mother describes a story that she has been told over the years about the eighth Duchess, my namesake, Violet, Duchess of Rutland. Every time anyone in the local community would have a child, she would always ensure that linen and sheets and was sent down to the women in the local villages that had recently had children. And I think these are all historic stories that I'm referencing. But actually, in our country right now, I think historic houses are about to play an increasingly important role in rural communities because for various reasons, which I won't go into, but our economy is pretty shot right now.
Yes.
And the local communities that surround these historic houses heavily rely upon them. I mean, I was just speaking before this call to one of our member houses called Doddington Park. It's in North Lincolnshire. They employed 222 people.
Right.
She just told me that. And that's in an area that's not densely populated. So those 222 people, that's 222 families that otherwise wouldn't have employment were it not for these houses. So they are incredibly important today and historically. And I think again, that's a big reason why I love the membership in the club that I've mentioned, because we get to have the owners or the teams kind of actually talk about sort of what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I think it gives everyone such a great insight and window into the role that they do play in their communities and how important it really is.
Well, this brings me actually to my second question, and again, an intimate and private question, and that is the word stress. So the
Mm,
second thing that we think about is, as you said, we would say in the US, these houses can go out of business.
hmm
And that would be just like the biggest merchant in a mall going out of business. It has a big butterfly effect, which is
mm.
what you're saying. In your own home, because these are very expensive homes to keep up. In your own home as you were growing up, was there a sniff of that kind of stress and concern? If not, was it kept from you or did you just sail through?
No, it was so present. And I think, I would be a fool if I didn't admit or say or acknowledge the fact that I don't think I'd be building this business, Adrian, if I hadn't seen with my own eyes as a young girl the difficulty of keeping these places together and intact and the roof on. There is no doubt my passion for what we're doing with Heritage Explore is born from my childhood because I've witnessed firsthand, a ceiling falling into a library and the impact that that has and the length of time that's spent restoring that and the money that has to go into restoring it. I've seen that with my own eyes. At age 10, we'd just moved into Beaver. And I remember my mother coming to wake us up and asking us to put our wellies on. We'd just gone to bed and put our dressing gowns on. And we climbed with my mother up onto the roof. I was 10, my sister was 8. And because we had the smallest hands, we were the ones that were having to put our hands down the drain to get the pigeon out. We'd just moved in and we were my mum had young children, 3 young girls. When a roof caves in to a library, it becomes your priority. And I think that's just one story of dozens that I could give you about the reality. This was in the 90s when we moved in, and I think, houses were just starting to open to the public. It was a very different world that historic houses found themselves into where they do today. I've witnessed the journey of Beaver being on the brink of, virtually on the brink of collapse to now being a thriving place. You can walk through the doors at Beaver 100 days a year. And so it's a testament. Beaver is one example of hundreds that we work with to the journey of a historic house and how that's changed so drastically in the course of the last 20 years.
And sadly, we're getting to the end of our show, but this is a question that may be bringing you back to your childhood. What are the things that we noted from movies, sometimes romanticized books, is a formality. And we do associate English culture in general and English temperament as formal and reticent, let's say, unemotional. These are some of the stereotypes. And we see parents patting a child on the head and saying, they're there, and then bring them off to their nanny. Because I worked so much, and my husband worked so much, we had nannies, but it was messy. And we had a messy household in every way you could think, noisy and messy. What's the reality of that kind of childhood? Was it as formal as it looks?
I think, my childhood, our childhood is, I've got four younger siblings. I'm the oldest of five. But I have to say, the childhood you've just described very much sounds like the childhood my father experienced growing up at Beaver. For me, it was very, very much not that. And I think that's because my mother is from Wales. She grew up on a beautiful farm in Wales. And so she didn't grow up in a castle or a historic house. So she came into, the marriage to my father with a very different understanding of what it meant to be a parent in the 90s. And I don't doubt if my father had ended up marrying someone else, I think we may have had quite a removed childhood from our parents. But my mother, being my mother, was very much, she held us all very close, and we were allowed to, enjoy Beaver. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts she could ever have given us growing up at Beaver. It would be very easy for someone to say, no, no, don't touch that, don't do this, don't go near that painting, or don't go near that beautiful vase, and of course there was a bit of that, but we were mostly allowed to enjoy Beaver, and all of the wonderful team that work at Beaver, they've grown up with us and we've grown up with them. And the Wendy, who still works in the restaurant at Beaver, or just beneath Beaver, we've got this wonderful farm shop and restaurant. She still remembers when my mum used to send me to go and work with her in the school holidays in the restaurant. And I used to wait on tables, and I learnt about, service all through Wendy and my time, in the holidays, earning some pocket money. So I think we had a very, we did have a very sort of quote unquote normal with my mother and my father relationship, and there was lots of hugging and lots of being told that you're loved. But I recognize that's very different to the childhood that my father experienced, for sure.
So this is really fascinating. And there's so many more questions and so many more things we can do. But the easiest thing to do is to join Heritage, to join your organization, HeritageXplore, to go on one of the trips, which there are many. Maybe there'll be more and more with greater accessibility. We'd love to see that happen. And we very much appreciate you opening up your thoughts, your own personal history, what you're doing here on this Anglophile series that we have. So that's really quite amazing. And as I ask every guest, if you had a magic wand, this is my favorite magic wand question. If you had a magic wand and you could change one thing that's happening to the grand homes of England or Britain today, what would be the one thing that you would love to see happen?
Wow, that's a big question. I think if I had a magic wand and I could just sort of over all of the houses that, the independent houses, I would unequivocally eradicate that £2 billion restoration bill. And I just fix all the, fix everything. I just sort of fix every single tapestry, every single painting, every single roof, every single lead piping problem, every single heating issue. I'd fix all of that, I think, with one fell swoop if I could, for everyone, because I think that would give everyone the opportunity to breathe a little more deeply, and actually just be at peace a bit more with kind of what they have on their hands, and excited by what they can create from it. That springboard, I think it would give everyone such a wonderful sort of fresh springboard to sort of dive off from.
So that beautiful answer. And of course, what you're really saying is you'd be eliminating the danger that these houses would not be there for the
Yeah,
next generation and next generation. So we
exactly.
thank you so much. And I have to remind everybody that, of course, Travel Tuesday comes to you every single week. It's always free. You just go to agelesstraveler.com and subscribe. I will remind you that this will be archived on Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you listen. I will also remind you that we're a community. You can go to our Facebook salon where you can, again, free of charge, become part of our private group. You do that and everything through Ageless Traveler. And when you book, the way you support us is, again, go to agelesstraveler.com, take a look at our tools and discount site, and you can do everything from getting your car to your hotel to your tour through us, and we get a small compensation for that, and that is what allows us to have wonderful guests on, like our Viscountess. So thank you so much. This has been really a wonderful, eye-opening visit.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure being able to talk about the subject that I love so much with you and your wonderful listeners. So thank you.
And it's very clear your love and compassion for the even the owners. So everybody else, you know what I'm going to say. Never stop traveling.